The morning sun cast long shadows across the Afghan mountainside as Commander Sarah Mitchell adjusted her rifle scope one final time. The weight of leadership pressed heavily on her shoulders, but nothing compared to the weight of the decision she was about to make. 3 years of training, 2 deployments, and countless missions had led to this moment. She never imagined that a single bullet would change everything. Sarah had grown up in a small town in Montana, where hunting with her father was as natural as breathing. Her steady hands and sharp eyes made her the best shot in 3 counties by age 16. When she announced her intention to join the Navy SEALs, most people laughed. Women weren't even allowed in combat roles back then, but Sarah had a way of making impossible things happen. The path to becoming a SEAL was brutal. She endured Hell Week twice after an injury forced her to restart training. The instructors pushed her harder than anyone else, knowing that every eye in the military was watching. Some wanted her to fail. Others desperately wanted her to succeed. Sarah focused only on the mission ahead, one obstacle at a time. Her first deployment to Iraq taught her that war was nothing like the movies. The heat, the constant tension, the weight of making life and death decisions every day. She learned to trust her team completely and earned their trust in return. By her second deployment, she had proven herself as one of the finest operators in the unit. The intelligence briefing that morning had been straightforward. A high-value target was meeting with local Taliban commanders in a compound nestled between 2 ridges. The target had been responsible for multiple attacks on coalition forces and was planning something bigger. The mission was simple: capture or eliminate. What made this mission different was the terrain. The compound sat in a valley with only one approach route. Any team going in would be exposed and vulnerable. Command decided on a different strategy. Sarah would take an overwatch position on the ridge, providing sniper support while a smaller team moved in for the capture. As she settled into position before dawn, Sarah felt the familiar calm that came before action. Her spotter, Sergeant Rodriguez, had worked with her on dozens of missions. They communicated with hand signals and shared glances, a partnership forged through trust and experience. The compound below looked peaceful in the early morning light. Chickens pecked in the courtyard while an old man tended to a small garden. It was hard to believe that behind those mud walls, plans were being made to kill American soldiers. Rodriguez spotted movement first. A convoy of vehicles approached from the east, kicking up dust clouds that could be seen for miles. Sarah counted 14 men as they exited the vehicles and entered the compound. Some carried weapons openly. Others tried to conceal them under traditional robes. Through her scope, Sarah studied each face. Intelligence photos had shown her the target, but in the harsh morning light with men moving quickly and partially obscured by shadows, identification would be challenging. One wrong shot could kill an innocent person or alert the entire group to their presence. The radio crackled softly in her ear. The assault team was in position and waiting for her signal. They were exposed in the valley below, counting on her to provide cover if things went wrong. The weight of their lives rested on her shoulders and her ability to make split-second decisions. Sarah had made difficult shots before, but never with so much at stake. The distance was manageable, about 800 meters, well within her capabilities. The wind was calm, visibility was good. Everything was perfect except for one problem. She couldn't get a clear identification of the target. Minutes passed like hours as Sarah watched through her scope. The men moved in and out of buildings, sometimes alone, sometimes in groups. Twice she thought she had identified the target, but both times shadows or movement obscured her view before she could be certain. Rodriguez whispered updates about the assault team's position. They were getting restless, exposed in their hiding spot as the sun climbed higher. Soon, local farmers would begin their daily routines, and the window for this mission would close. Sarah's finger rested lightly on the trigger as she tracked movement in the compound. Her breathing was controlled, her heart rate steady. Years of training had prepared her for this moment, but training couldn't prepare her for what happened next. A door opened in the main building, and a man stepped into the courtyard. Sarah immediately recognized him from the intelligence photos. The target was finally in the open, presenting a clear shot. She adjusted her aim, compensating for distance and elevation. But as she prepared to squeeze the trigger, something made her pause. The man wasn't alone. A young boy, maybe 8 years old, ran out of the building behind him. The target scooped up the child, laughing as he spun him around in the courtyard. Sarah's world stopped. Through her scope, she watched the target playing with the child. his face transformed by genuine joy and love. For a moment, he wasn't a terrorist or a military target. He was just a father playing with his son. The radio crackled again. The assault team reported movement on the access road. More vehicles were approaching, and if they didn't act soon, the mission would be compromised. Sarah had to make a decision, and she had to make it now. Her training said to wait for a clear shot without civilian casualties. Her orders said to eliminate the target. Her heart said that no mission was worth risking an innocent child's life. But her mind calculated the cost of letting this man live. More American soldiers would die. More families would lose fathers and sons. Sarah steadied her breathing and made her choice. The target stepped away from the child for just a moment, turning to speak with one of his men. It was a narrow window, but it was enough. The shot was perfect. Sarah watched through her scope as the target fell instantly. But what happened next would haunt her for the rest of her life. The other 13 men in the compound didn't scatter or take cover as expected. Instead, they began moving with military precision, taking defensive positions as if they had been waiting for this moment. Sarah realized with growing horror that she had walked into a trap. The compound erupted into chaos, but it was organized chaos. Sarah watched in growing alarm as the remaining 13 men moved with the precision of trained soldiers, not the panicked scrambling of surprised terrorists. They had been expecting her shot, waiting for it. Rodriguez cursed softly beside her as machine gun fire erupted from concealed positions around the compound. The assault team was pinned down in the valley, caught in a crossfire that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Their radio calls were urgent but controlled, requesting immediate support. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to understand what had gone wrong. The intelligence had been solid, the target confirmed through multiple sources. But now it was clear that the entire operation had been compromised from the beginning. They weren't hunting the enemy. They were the ones being hunted. Through her scope, Sarah could see muzzle flashes from at least 6 different positions around the compound. The men below weren't just armed with rifles. They had prepared defensive positions with heavy machine guns and what looked like rocket-propelled grenades. This wasn't a meeting. It was an ambush. The assault team leader's voice crackled through the radio, tension evident in his controlled tone. 3 men were wounded and they were running low on ammunition. The escape route they had planned was now covered by enemy fire. They needed Sarah to clear a path, but from her position, she could only see a fraction of the enemy positions. Sarah began systematically engaging targets, her rifle barking as she sent round after round toward the compound. Each shot was carefully aimed, each one finding its mark. She had never missed under pressure, and she wasn't about to start now. But for every enemy fighter she eliminated, it seemed like 2 more appeared from hidden positions. The young boy she had seen earlier was nowhere to be found, hopefully taken to safety when the shooting started. Sarah pushed thoughts of him from her mind and focused on the immediate threat to her team. There would be time for reflection later, if any of them survived this day. Rodriguez was calling out targets and estimating ranges, his voice steady despite the chaos below. They had worked together so many times that they functioned like a single unit. He would spot a target, and Sarah's rifle would speak almost before he finished giving the location. But the enemy had spotted their position too. Bullets began striking the rocks around them, sending sharp fragments flying through the air. A sniper somewhere in the compound had ranged them and was walking shots closer to their hiding spot. They would have to move soon or risk being overrun. Sarah made a decision that went against every tactical manual she had ever studied. Instead of falling back to a secondary position, she moved forward, closer to the enemy. Sometimes the most unexpected action was the most effective one. From her new position, Sarah had a better view of the compound and could see the full scope of the trap that had been set for them. The buildings had been modified with firing ports and reinforced positions. Tunnels connected different parts of the compound, allowing fighters to move unseen between buildings. This wasn't a hastily prepared ambush. Someone had spent weeks, maybe months, preparing this killing ground. They had known about the mission, known about the assault team, and had prepared accordingly. The question was how they had obtained such detailed intelligence about American operations. Sarah's new position gave her the angle she needed to help her trapped teammates, but it also made her more vulnerable. Enemy fighters were beginning to scale the ridgeline, trying to flank her position. She was caught between helping the assault team and defending herself. The math was simple but brutal. 14 enemy fighters in the compound, plus an unknown number approaching her position. 8 American soldiers, including herself and Rodriguez. They were outnumbered and outgunned, fighting on terrain chosen by the enemy. But Sarah had advantages too. Superior training, better equipment, and most importantly, the desperate motivation that comes from fighting for the lives of your teammates. She had never lost a man under her command, and she wasn't about to start today. The first enemy fighter to reach the ridgeline appeared just 50 meters from Sarah's position. He was young, maybe 19, with the lean build of someone who had grown up in these mountains. His AK-47 was well maintained, and his movements showed military training. Sarah's shot took him in the chest before he could bring his weapon to bear. She immediately shifted position, knowing that his companions would have seen the muzzle flash and would be targeting her location. Rodriguez was already moving, gathering their equipment and preparing to displace to their next position. The radio brought more bad news. The assault team's medic reported that one of the wounded men was in critical condition and needed immediate evacuation. But with enemy fighters controlling the high ground around the compound, helicopter extraction was impossible. Sarah realized that standard tactics weren't going to work in this situation. They needed something unconventional, something the enemy wouldn't expect. As she studied the terrain and enemy positions, a dangerous plan began to form in her mind. The compound had been prepared as a defensive position, but it also had weaknesses. The tunnels that allowed fighters to move unseen could also be used against them. If Sarah could get inside the compound, she could attack from an unexpected direction, while the assault team provided a distraction. It was a suicide mission by any reasonable standard. One person against an unknown number of enemy fighters in terrain they knew better than she did. But it might be the only way to save her team. Rodriguez read her expression and shook his head before she could even explain the plan. He had seen that look before, usually right before Sarah did something that the training manuals would classify as insane, but that somehow always worked. Sarah began explaining her plan in whispered, urgent tones. Rodriguez would remain in overwatch, providing sniper support and coordinating with the assault team. She would work her way down the ridgeline and approach the compound from the rear, where the enemy wouldn't expect an attack. The plan had almost no chance of success, but it was better than watching her team die in the valley below. Sarah checked her equipment one final time, redistributing ammunition and ensuring her communications gear was secure. As she prepared to leave the relative safety of her position, Sarah allowed herself one moment to consider what she was about to attempt. In her mind, she could still see the target playing with his child, that moment of pure joy before her bullet ended his life. Now she was about to risk her own life to save her teammates from the consequences of that shot. War was full of such contradictions. You killed to preserve life, took enormous risks to protect others, and sometimes the only way to end violence was with more violence. Sarah had made peace with these contradictions long ago, but they still weighed on her as she began her dangerous descent toward the compound. The laughter had indeed died quickly, replaced by the grim mathematics of combat. But Sarah was determined that her teammates would not join the casualties of this day, no matter what it cost her personally. Sarah moved like a ghost down the rocky slope, every step calculated to avoid loose stones that might betray her position. The sounds of battle echoed across the valley behind her, but she forced herself to focus on the immediate task. One mistake now would doom not just herself, but the entire team. The rear of the compound was less fortified than the front, but Sarah knew better than to assume it was undefended. These fighters had shown too much preparation and tactical awareness to leave their back door completely open. She paused behind a cluster of boulders, studying the approaches through her rifle scope. A single guard patrolled the rear wall, moving in a predictable pattern that suggested professional training rather than casual vigilance. Sarah timed his movements, counting the seconds it took him to complete each circuit. She would have a narrow window when he turned the far corner, maybe 15 seconds to cross open ground and reach the wall. The guard was young, like most fighters in this region, but his weapon handling and movement showed experience. Sarah felt the familiar weight of taking another life, but pushed the emotion aside. There would be time for reflection later if she survived long enough. When the guard turned the corner, Sarah moved. She covered the 30 meters of open ground in seconds, pressing herself against the mud brick wall just as the guard's footsteps approached from the other side. Her knife was ready, the blade gleaming dully in the harsh sunlight. The guard rounded the corner directly into Sarah's waiting arms. Her hand covered his mouth while the knife found the precise spot between his ribs. He struggled briefly, then went limp. Sarah lowered him gently to the ground, already scanning for her next move. The wall was higher than it had appeared from a distance, but Sarah found handholds in the weathered brick and pulled herself up. The compound's interior layout was more complex than the intelligence briefings had suggested. Instead of simple rectangular buildings, there was a maze of interconnected structures, courtyards, and covered walkways. Sarah dropped silently into a small courtyard filled with the ordinary debris of daily life. Cooking pots, children's toys, laundry hung on lines. It was a stark reminder that this place had been home to families before it became a battlefield. The sound of gunfire was closer now, and Sarah could hear voices shouting in Pashto from different parts of the compound. The fighters were coordinating their defense, but their focus was entirely on the assault team in the valley. None of them expected an attack from within their own walls. Sarah moved carefully through the maze of buildings, her rifle ready, but preferring stealth to direct confrontation. Every corner could hide an enemy fighter. Every doorway could be her last. The compound was larger than it had appeared from the ridgeline, with more rooms and passages than the satellite images had revealed. She found the first tunnel entrance in what appeared to be a storage room. The opening was concealed behind stacked grain bags, but Sarah could feel the air movement that indicated a passage beyond. This was how the fighters had been moving unseen between positions. The tunnel was narrow and dark, barely wide enough for a person to crawl through. Sarah hesitated for a moment, knowing that entering would trap her in a confined space with no room to maneuver. But it might also give her access to the main defensive positions from an unexpected direction. Rodriguez's voice whispered through her earpiece, providing updates on the situation above ground. The assault team was holding their position, but ammunition was running low, and the wounded man was deteriorating. Time was running out for all of them. Sarah entered the tunnel, her rifle slung across her back and her sidearm drawn. The passage angled downward, then curved to the right. She could hear voices ahead, muffled but distinct. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber that appeared to be directly beneath the main building. The chamber was a revelation. Maps covered the walls, showing detailed layouts of American bases and patrol routes. Communication equipment filled one corner, sophisticated gear that was far beyond what local fighters should possess. This wasn't just an ambush site. It was an intelligence gathering center. But what shocked Sarah most were the photographs pinned to one wall. Pictures of her team, taken with telephoto lenses during previous operations. There was even a photo of her in her sniper position from earlier that morning. They had been under surveillance for weeks, maybe months. The implications hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't just about one compromised mission. Someone with access to classified American intelligence had been feeding information to the enemy for an extended period. How many operations had been compromised? How many soldiers had died because of this betrayal? Sarah photographed everything she could with a small camera from her kit, knowing that this intelligence would be crucial to rooting out the source of the leaks. But first, she had to survive long enough to deliver it. Voices were approaching the chamber from another tunnel entrance. Sarah found concealment behind a stack of ammunition boxes and waited. Two fighters entered, speaking in low, urgent tones. One was older, clearly in command, while the other was younger and nervous. Sarah understood enough Pashto to catch fragments of their conversation. They were discussing the battle above, but also something about the woman sniper and how pleased their American friend would be that the trap had worked. The confirmation that there was indeed an American traitor sent ice through Sarah's veins. The older fighter was examining the maps, pointing to positions around the valley and giving instructions to his companion. Sarah realized they were planning to shift their fighters to prevent any escape by the assault team. Her teammates were about to face an even more coordinated attack. Sarah made her decision quickly. She couldn't take both men alive for interrogation, but she couldn't let them coordinate the attack either. Her suppressed pistol whispered twice in the confined space, dropping both fighters before they could react. The sound of gunfire above was intensifying, and Sarah knew she was running out of time. She had to find a way to disrupt the enemy's coordination and give her team a chance to escape. The communication equipment in the chamber gave her an idea. Sarah had cross-trained on enemy communication systems during her intelligence courses. The equipment here was more sophisticated than usual, but the basic principles were the same. If she could access their command frequency, she might be able to create enough confusion to break up their coordinated defense. Working quickly, Sarah began cycling through frequencies on the main radio unit. She found the command channel and listened to the tactical chatter between different positions. The enemy fighters were indeed preparing to shift positions and tighten the noose around her trapped teammates. Sarah keyed the microphone and began issuing contradictory orders in her limited Pashto. She told the eastern positions to fall back to secondary locations, ordered the northern group to conserve ammunition, and reported fictional American reinforcements approaching from the west. The confusion was immediate. Radio chatter increased as position commanders tried to clarify their orders. Some fighters began moving to new positions while others remained in place, unsure of which orders were legitimate. But Sarah's deception wouldn't hold for long. Soon someone would realize that an infiltrator had accessed their communications. She needed to move fast to take advantage of the confusion she had created. The chamber had 3 tunnel exits, and Sarah chose the one that seemed to lead toward the main building, where most of the enemy fire was originating. If she could eliminate the fighters there, it would give the assault team the opening they needed to extract their wounded and escape. As she crawled through the narrow passage, Sarah could hear the enemy fighters above trying to sort out the conflicting orders they had received. Some were angry, others confused. The tight coordination they had maintained was breaking down into arguments and uncertainty. Sarah emerged from the tunnel into the basement of the main building. Above her, she could hear heavy footsteps and multiple voices. This was clearly the enemy command center, and if her plan was going to work, this was where she would have to make her stand. Sarah climbed the wooden stairs from the basement with infinite care, each step testing her weight before committing fully. The voices above were clearer now, at least 6 different speakers arguing about the conflicting radio orders. Her deception was working, but she could hear growing suspicion in their tones. The main floor of the building was a single large room with firing positions cut into the walls facing the valley. Sarah counted 8 fighters, some manning machine gun positions while others coordinated with forces throughout the compound via handheld radios. They were positioned with their backs to the stairway, focused entirely on the battle outside. Sarah's training kicked in automatically. 8 targets in a confined space, armed and alert. Her rifle would be too unwieldy in close quarters, so she drew her sidearm and 2 flashbang grenades from her vest. The room's layout gave her one significant advantage. All the fighters were clustered near the front wall, giving her a clear field of fire from the stairs. She pulled the pins on both grenades simultaneously, counting the seconds before release. The throws had to be perfect. Too close to the fighters and they might kick them away. Too far and the blast effects would be minimized in the large room. The grenades clattered across the floor, and Sarah closed her eyes and covered her ears just as the world exploded in light and sound. Even prepared for the blast, the concussion was overwhelming in the enclosed space. She couldn't imagine what it was doing to the fighters who had taken it full force. Sarah moved before the echoes faded, her weapon tracking from target to target with mechanical precision. The fighters were disoriented, some on the ground clutching their ears, others stumbling blindly with hands over their eyes. None of them were able to return fire effectively. Her pistol spoke 8 times in rapid succession. Sarah had trained for this exact scenario countless times in kill houses and training facilities. But the reality was always more chaotic than practice. Bodies fell, voices cried out, and the acrid smoke from the flashbangs made breathing difficult. When the shooting stopped, Sarah performed an immediate tactical reload and began checking the bodies. All 8 fighters were down, but she had learned never to assume anything in combat. One young man was still breathing, blood frothing from his mouth. Sarah knelt beside him, checking for weapons before attempting first aid. The fighter's eyes focused on her with difficulty, pupils dilated from the flashbang blast. He said something in Pashto, too quietly for Sarah to understand. She offered him water from her canteen, but he was beyond help. He died while she was still trying to stop the bleeding. Sarah felt the familiar weight of taking lives multiplied by 8. Each of these men had families, friends, dreams that had been cut short by her actions. But she also knew that every one of them would have killed her teammates without hesitation. War reduced everything to these stark mathematical equations. The radio chatter from outside was becoming more organized, as the fighters throughout the compound realized they had been deceived. Sarah could hear footsteps approaching the building from multiple directions. Her element of surprise was gone, and soon she would be trapped in the room with no escape route. Rodriguez's voice crackled through her earpiece with an update that sent ice through her veins. The critically wounded member of the assault team had lost consciousness, and they were running out of time for evacuation. Worse, enemy fighters had been spotted moving to cut off their only escape route. Sarah grabbed one of the enemy radios and switched to the assault team's frequency. She gave her position and status, then outlined a plan that was born from desperation and experience in impossible situations. She would continue to disrupt enemy operations from inside the compound, while the assault team fought their way to the extraction point. The plan required perfect timing and more than a little luck. Sarah would create as much chaos as possible to keep the enemy fighters focused on her rather than the escaping Americans. It was essentially a suicide mission, but it was the only way to save her team. Sarah began her one-woman war against the remaining fighters in the compound. She moved from room to room, using the building's layout and her superior training to engage targets at close range. Each encounter was brief and violent, decided by split seconds and years of preparation. The enemy fighters were brave and determined, but they were facing someone who had trained for close-quarters combat since she was 18 years old. Sarah's movements were economical and precise, each shot placed exactly where it needed to be. But numbers were against her. For every fighter she eliminated, it seemed like two more appeared from other parts of the compound. Sarah was running low on ammunition and high on adrenaline, operating on instinct and muscle memory. She found herself in a storage room with no other exit as voices surrounded the building outside. Through the single small window, Sarah could see fighters taking positions to storm her location. She had maybe minutes before they breached the room. Sarah used the time to call in her final report to Rodriguez, providing coordinates for all the intelligence she had discovered and confirming the location of the underground command center. The information about American involvement in the ambush was crucial, even if she didn't survive to see the investigation that would follow. Rodriguez's voice was tight with emotion as he acknowledged her report. They both knew this was likely their final communication. The assault team had reached the extraction point, but the wounded man needed immediate medical attention. The helicopter was inbound, but it couldn't wait. Sarah made the decision that defined her entire military career. She ordered Rodriguez to go with the team to ensure they all made it home safely. As team commander, it was her responsibility to see that her people survived, even if it meant sacrificing herself. The enemy fighters began their assault on the building, just as Sarah heard the distant sound of helicopter rotors. The rescue bird was coming for her team, but it would be too late for her. She had known from the moment she decided to enter the compound that this was likely a one-way mission. Sarah positioned herself behind a heavy wooden table that would provide minimal cover against the automatic weapons fire she expected. She had one magazine left in her rifle and two for her sidearm. Not much ammunition for a final stand, but it would have to be enough. The first fighter through the door walked into Sarah's crosshairs and dropped immediately. The second was more cautious, using the doorframe for cover, but Sarah's training had prepared her for this exact scenario. Her shot found its mark despite the limited angle. More fighters poured through the door, firing on full automatic and filling the room with flying lead and debris. Sarah moved constantly, using furniture and architectural features for cover while returning precise fire. Every shot had to count now. The helicopter's rotors were getting louder, which meant her team was getting closer to safety. Sarah found strength in that knowledge, fighting harder as the circle of enemies tightened around her position. She eliminated 3 more fighters before taking her first hit. A bullet that grazed her left shoulder and spun her around behind an overturned table. Blood soaked her uniform, but the wound wasn't immediately life-threatening. Sarah gritted her teeth and continued fighting. The ammunition counter in her mind told her she had maybe 20 rounds left across all her weapons. 20 shots to hold off an unknown number of fighters until her team was safely away. The mathematics of survival had never been more stark. Sarah could hear the helicopter landing in the distance, followed by the sound of her teammates being evacuated. Rodriguez's voice came through her earpiece one final time, reporting that all personnel were aboard and the bird was lifting off. Her mission was complete, even if her survival was now in serious doubt. As the sound of the helicopter faded into the distance, Sarah found herself smiling despite her desperate situation. Her team was safe. The mission to eliminate the target had been successful, even if it had cost far more than anyone had anticipated. She had done her job as a commander, protecting the people under her care. The silence after the helicopter's departure was broken only by the heavy breathing of the fighters surrounding Sarah's position. She could hear them repositioning outside the room, their voices low and careful. They knew she was wounded and running low on ammunition, but they also knew she had already killed more than a dozen of their comrades. Sarah pressed her back against the overturned table and tried to assess her situation objectively. The shoulder wound was bleeding steadily but hadn't hit any major arteries. She had perhaps 15 rounds left between her rifle and sidearm. Most critically, she was trapped in a room with only one exit, facing an unknown number of determined enemies. The smart tactical decision would be to surrender and hope for prisoner exchange later, but Sarah knew too much about the intelligence leak and the American involvement in the ambush. If these fighters had been willing to sacrifice their own commander to draw her team into a trap, they wouldn't hesitate to eliminate a captured American operator who possessed sensitive information. A voice called out in accented English from beyond the doorway. The speaker identified himself as the compound's military leader and offered Sarah terms for surrender. He promised medical treatment and eventual prisoner exchange, speaking in the reasonable tone of someone conducting a business negotiation. Sarah almost laughed at the absurdity of the situation. Here she was, bleeding and outgunned, being offered a deal by the very people who had orchestrated an elaborate ambush using intelligence provided by an American traitor. The whole thing felt surreal, like a scene from a movie rather than her actual life. She called back that she needed time to consider the offer, buying herself a few more minutes to think. The enemy commander was patient, probably assuming that blood loss and shock would eventually make her more reasonable. He didn't understand that Sarah had already made her choice when she entered the compound. Sarah used the brief reprieve to complete one final task. She activated the GPS beacon that would bring recovery teams to this location eventually. More importantly, she uploaded the photographs of the intelligence cache to her encrypted communication device, ensuring that the evidence of American betrayal would reach the appropriate authorities, even if she didn't survive. The data upload took longer than expected, the satellite connection weak in the mountainous terrain. Sarah watched the progress bar crawl across the device's small screen, while listening for sounds of movement outside. The enemy fighters were being patient, but their patience wouldn't last forever. When the upload completed successfully, Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Whatever happened next, the mission would have lasting consequences beyond just eliminating one target. The investigation that would follow would root out the source of the intelligence leaks and potentially save countless American lives. The enemy commander called out again, his tone less patient than before. Sarah could hear his men moving closer to the doorway, preparing for another assault. She gripped her rifle tighter and checked her ammunition count one more time. 14 rounds in the rifle, 6 in her sidearm. It would have to be enough. Sarah's mind drifted briefly to her childhood in Montana, hunting elk with her father in the mountains that looked much like these. He had taught her that the most important quality in a hunter wasn't accuracy or patience, but respect. Respect for the prey, respect for the weapon, and respect for the responsibility that came with taking a life. She had carried that lesson through her military career, never taking pleasure in violence but understanding its necessity. Each life she had taken weighed on her, but she had learned to carry that weight as part of the job. Today would add significantly to that burden, but it was a price she was willing to pay. The first fighter appeared in the doorway, moving fast and low, his AK-47 already firing. Sarah's shot took him center mass before he could acquire a target, but his wild spray forced her to dive for new cover behind a concrete pillar. Chunks of masonry exploded around her as more fighters poured through the doorway. Sarah's return fire was measured and precise, each shot carefully aimed despite the chaos around her. She dropped 2 more fighters before being forced to reload behind rapidly deteriorating cover. The concrete pillar was being chewed apart by sustained automatic weapons fire. The mathematics of the situation were simple and brutal. She was outnumbered by at least 6-1, trapped in a confined space with limited ammunition and cover that was being systematically destroyed. By any reasonable tactical assessment, her situation was hopeless. But Sarah had never been particularly reasonable when it came to protecting her people. Even though her team was now safely away, she still had one more job to do. The longer she kept these fighters focused on her, the more time her teammates had to reach friendly territory and deliver their intelligence. A grenade clattered across the floor toward her position, bouncing off the wall and rolling behind her cover. Sarah had perhaps 2 seconds to react before the blast would shred her location. She dove forward, rolling across open ground as the explosion destroyed what remained of the pillar. The blast threw Sarah against the far wall, hard enough to knock the breath from her lungs. Her rifle was gone, probably buried under debris from the explosion, but her sidearm was still holstered. She drew it with hands that shook slightly from the concussion. Through the smoke and dust, Sarah could see figures moving toward her position. Her hearing was compromised by the grenade blast, but her vision was clear enough to identify targets. She fired twice, dropping the closest fighter, then rolled behind a pile of rubble as return fire kicked dust from the walls around her. Sarah's shoulder wound had reopened during her dive, and she could feel blood running down her arm. The room was filling with smoke from burning debris, making it harder to see targets clearly. But the smoke also concealed her movements from the enemy fighters. She used the concealment to change positions, crawling through the debris field to a spot with better lines of sight. The enemy fighters were moving more cautiously now, having learned to respect her accuracy the hard way. Sarah counted muzzle flashes and tried to estimate how many fighters remained. At least 4, possibly more, waiting outside the room. Her ammunition was down to 3 rounds in her pistol, with no spare magazines remaining. Every shot would have to count. The smoke was beginning to clear, which would expose her new position soon. Sarah made a decision that surprised even herself. Instead of waiting for the enemy to find her, she stood up and walked into the open, her pistol raised and ready. The boldness of the move caught the fighters off guard for a crucial second. Sarah used that hesitation to put 2 rounds into the nearest target before diving behind an overturned desk as return fire erupted around her. 1 round left and at least 3 enemies still moving. A young fighter appeared around the edge of her cover, his rifle swinging toward her position. Sarah's last bullet took him in the forehead before he could fire. Her pistol clicked empty, and she was truly defenseless for the first time since entering the compound. The remaining fighters sensed her vulnerability and began moving to surround her position. Sarah found a piece of rebar in the debris and gripped it like a club. If this was going to be her final fight, she would meet it on her feet with a weapon in her hand. But before the fighters could close the distance, the distinctive sound of American helicopters filled the air outside. Not the single bird that had evacuated her team, but multiple aircraft approaching fast and low. Sarah felt a surge of hope that she immediately tried to suppress. The enemy fighters heard the helicopters too and began shouting to each other in urgent tones. Some wanted to finish her quickly and escape. Others argued for using her as a hostage. The disagreement bought Sarah precious seconds as the sound of rotors grew louder. Suddenly, the building shook as explosive charges detonated against the outer walls. The rescue team wasn't attempting a subtle extraction. They were coming through the walls with overwhelming force. Sarah pressed herself against the floor as debris rained down from the ceiling. Combat boots appeared in the breach before the dust had settled. American voices shouted tactical commands as a full special operations team poured into the building. The remaining enemy fighters were caught between Sarah's position and the new arrivals, their defensive positions now worthless. The firefight was brief and one-sided. The rescue team moved with the same precision Sarah had shown throughout the day, their superior training and equipment overwhelming the surprised fighters. Within minutes, the room was secure, and medics were rushing to Sarah's position. As hands lifted her onto a stretcher, Sarah tried to protest that she could walk. But the adrenaline that had sustained her through the battle was fading rapidly, replaced by exhaustion and blood loss. The medic inserting an IV line told her to save her strength for the debrief that would follow. During the helicopter ride back to base, Sarah learned that Rodriguez had refused to leave without mounting a rescue operation. He had convinced command that Sarah's intelligence was too valuable to lose, and that she deserved extraction after completing an impossible mission. The full story of her actions in the compound had elevated her from missing operator to high-priority rescue. Sarah closed her eyes as the helicopter carried her away from the battlefield, but she couldn't escape the images burned into her memory. The target playing with his child, the young fighters she had killed, the evidence of American betrayal. The day had started with a simple mission and evolved into something far more complex and costly. The investigation that would follow would indeed uncover a network of corruption that reached high into the intelligence community. Several officials would face court-martial, and new security protocols would be implemented to prevent future betrayals. But those victories felt distant and abstract compared to the immediate cost in human lives. Sarah survived her wounds and returned to duty after a lengthy recovery. She continued to serve with distinction, but the events of that day changed her in ways that weren't immediately apparent. The weight of command had always been heavy, but now she carried the additional burden of knowing how quickly trust could be betrayed, and how high the price of that betrayal could be. 6 months after the compound assault, Sarah sat in a sterile conference room at the Pentagon, facing a panel of senior officers and intelligence officials. The investigation had uncovered a web of corruption that reached deeper into the American military establishment than anyone had imagined. Her photographs and testimony were crucial pieces of evidence in what would become the largest espionage case in recent military history. The betrayal had started small, as these things usually do. A mid-level intelligence analyst with gambling debts had begun selling routine patrol schedules to local contacts. Over time, the operation had grown more sophisticated, with multiple sources providing detailed operational intelligence to enemy fighters throughout the region. Sarah's discovery of the command center had provided investigators with the evidence they needed to trace the network back to its American sources. 3 military personnel and 2 civilian contractors were facing charges of treason, while dozens of others were under investigation for possible involvement or negligence. But the personal cost of that day continued to weigh heavily on Sarah's mind. The 14 men who had died in the compound had been soldiers, not terrorists. They had been following orders from their commanders just as she had been following hers. The difference was that her commanders had been legitimate, while theirs had been manipulated by American traitors. The young boy she had seen playing with the target haunted her dreams. Intelligence reports indicated that he was the target's nephew, not his son, and that he had survived the assault unharmed. But Sarah couldn't forget the moment of pure joy she had witnessed through her rifle scope. Just before she pulled the trigger that ended his uncle's life, war created these impossible moral equations, where the right tactical decision could be the wrong human one. Sarah had done her job perfectly that day, eliminating a legitimate military target and uncovering a critical intelligence leak. But perfection in war often came at a cost that was measured in more than just enemy casualties. The panel questioned Sarah extensively about her actions in the compound, particularly her decision to infiltrate alone rather than calling for backup. Some of the officers seemed to view her choices as reckless heroics rather than sound tactical decisions. Sarah explained patiently that backup wasn't available and that her teammates would have died without immediate action. What the panel didn't understand, and what Sarah couldn't adequately explain, was the weight of command responsibility. When your people are trapped and dying, tactical manuals become secondary to the simple imperative of bringing them home alive. Sarah had made the only choice available to her, knowing full well that it was likely a one-way mission. The investigation revealed that the ambush had been planned for weeks, with the American traitors providing detailed intelligence about Sarah's team composition, equipment, and typical operational patterns. The enemy had known about her sniper capabilities and had prepared accordingly, setting up the compound as an elaborate trap designed specifically to neutralize her effectiveness. What they hadn't counted on was Sarah's willingness to abandon standard operating procedures and improvise in the face of impossible odds. Her decision to enter the compound had been born from desperation, but it had also been exactly the kind of unconventional thinking that the enemy hadn't prepared for. The official, after-action report would credit Sarah with eliminating 14 enemy combatants and uncovering a critical intelligence breach that had compromised numerous American operations. She would receive the Silver Star for valor in combat, making her one of the most decorated female operators in Special Operations history. But awards and recognition couldn't change the fundamental reality of what had happened that day. Sarah had taken 14 lives to save 8. And while the mathematics of war made that a successful outcome, the human cost was something she would carry for the rest of her life. During her recovery, Sarah had visited the families of her teammates, including the widow of the man who had been critically wounded during the extraction. These visits were always difficult, but they reminded her why her actions had been necessary. These families still had their loved ones because of the choices she had made in that compound. Sarah returned to active duty with a new perspective on leadership and the cost of command decisions. She implemented new training protocols that emphasized unconventional thinking and individual initiative. Her teams learned to operate effectively, even when standard tactics failed or when they were cut off from support. The lessons learned from the compound assault influenced special operations doctrine for years to come. Sarah's after-action reports became required reading at military schools, not just for the tactical innovation she had demonstrated, but for the ethical complexities inherent in modern warfare. Years later, Sarah would retire from active duty and transition to a training role, passing on her hard-won experience to the next generation of operators. She never spoke publicly about the details of the compound assault, but her reputation as someone who would never abandon her people became legendary within the special operations community. The young boy from her memories grew up in a different Afghanistan, one where American troops were less common and where the complex games of international politics played out differently. Sarah sometimes wondered if he remembered his uncle, or the day when his world changed forever. She hoped that he had found peace and purpose beyond the violence that had touched his childhood. The target's laughter had indeed died quickly that morning, along with 13 of his men. But what emerged from that tragedy was a deeper understanding of the complexities of modern warfare and the price of protecting those who serve. Sarah's actions had prevented future ambushes and saved countless American lives, but the human cost of that success was something she would never forget. In her final evaluation before retirement, Sarah wrote that the hardest part of command wasn't making the difficult decisions, but living with the consequences of those decisions long after the immediate crisis had passed. The weight of 14 lives taken in service of 8 lives saved was a burden she carried willingly, but it was a burden nonetheless. The investigation continued for months after Sarah's testimony, eventually leading to significant changes in how operational intelligence was handled and shared. New security protocols were implemented, and the oversight of sensitive information was strengthened. The betrayal that had made the ambush possible would become much more difficult to repeat. But for Sarah, the most important outcome was simpler and more personal. Her teammates had all survived, had returned home to their families, and had continued their service. Rodriguez remained her closest friend and most trusted partner, and together they had saved lives and served their country with honor, despite the betrayal of others. The compound in Afghanistan was eventually destroyed by airstrikes, erasing the physical evidence of what had happened there. But the lessons learned and the lives affected by that day continued to ripple outward, influencing decisions and policies that would protect future generations of American service members. Sarah's story became part of the oral tradition of special operations, passed down from veteran operators to new recruits as an example of what it means to take care of your people, no matter the cost. The details were often classified, but the essential message was clear. Good leaders protect their teams, even when it requires the ultimate sacrifice. The 14 men who died that day had been casualties of a larger war, victims of decisions made by others and caught in the crossfire of conflicting loyalties. Sarah honored their sacrifice by ensuring that their deaths led to positive changes that would prevent similar tragedies. Their lives had meaning beyond the immediate circumstances of their deaths, becoming part of a larger story about duty, betrayal, and the complex moral landscape of modern warfare.